to invite our next speaker along. Sort of continuing this sort of building theme, I think, maybe in the sort of natural heritage link up. Dr. Coralie Mills is going to look at basically dendrochronology from our whole region, isn't it, really? So, without any further ado, Coralie.
Well, thanks very much, John. Thanks for inviting me to speak to this esteemed audience today. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about timbers, trees and time in the research project that I've been doing in South East Scotland, the South East Scotland Oak Dendrochronology project. And this has principally been funded by Historic Environment Scotland through an archaeological research grant. And I've been helped along the way by an enormous number of people. I could probably take my allotted time slot just thanking them all. But I won't do that. It would be rather like one of those terrible, tearful Oscar thank yous. So you know who you are. Thank you very much. And let's crack on with the talk. So why was I focusing? Why have I been focusing on oak in South East Scotland? Well, because it's a bit of a gap in our tree ring record for Scotland. You'll see on the map on the left, what we have are symbols marking the sites that have dendrodating, or at least that's how it was a few years ago, just before this project started. And if you have a look around the southeast of Scotland, you'll see a lot of red squares. Well, those red squares are showing sites with imported oak that's been dendrodated. The blue squares are sites that have native oak. There aren't very many of them in southeast Scotland. And the triangles are sites with pine. So the blue triangles are native pine. We see a lot of use of that up in the Caledonian pinewood areas. But we have this big gap in the southeast. We had a couple of dots on the map for native oak. The one right down in the borders is one timber from underneath Jedburgh Abbey that was dated a long time ago by Queen's University Belfast. And the blue dot near Edinburgh is actually the Dalkeith Old Oak, so that's a living woodland site, which I will mention in a bit. The other chart you see is a bar diagram, and I'm going to show you a few of these. So really just to explain that each bar on the chart is a site, and the extent of the bar shows the chronological time span of all the data that came out of timbers or trees from that site. And so you'll see that there's some shading, and the shading means something. The white bars near the bottom, the earlier sites, those are native oak sites. And this is for the whole of Scotland, right, from a few years ago. You can see that a lot of those bars are really long. There's a lot of long-lived native oak timber in our medieval sites in Scotland, and nearly all of it comes out of archaeological excavations and not from buildings. But then from about the middle of the 15th century, if you look at the right-hand end of the bars, left-hand end of the bars, sorry, those are the felling dates end. So a lot of the dates ending in the 15th century and later, all those grey bars, that's imported timber. So our record is really dominated by imported timber. And so why try to build native oak chronologies? Well, we do from time to time find sites with native oak in them. They can be incredibly difficult to date because we do not have the reference data for them, for native oak sources. And working on this site a long time ago for Scottish Borders Council really brought this to my mind, really highlighted this need, because it was ever so difficult to date this building, which was on Jedburgh High Street. It's recorded by Edinburgh Archaeology at the time. And it was only with great difficulty and piecing together data from Northern England that I was able to date that material to 1667. That's a felling date. And it really highlighted that need to develop our own native reference data for oak. Oh, what do I do there? There. So where am I looking? Well, I've confined this study to the Scottish borders, to Edinburgh and the Lothians. And I have to say here, my little blue map doesn't pick out West Lothian. I didn't deliberately exclude it, but I just didn't find any good sites there. I had done a first stage of this work before this actual South East Scotland project on the Dalkeith Old Oaks, which many of you will know already, and if you don't know them, they're really worth a visit. They're absolutely amazing. So this is in the park at Dalkeith Palace, basically, and there were a lot of fallen trees that had fallen in the storms in around about 2009, 2010, and I was allowed to take disc samples from some of the fallen trees and build up a long record that went back into the middle of the 16th century. And alongside a few living trees from a wood called Lord Ancram's Wood at Newbattle, created this quite long chronology, but it's only well replicated after 1700. So in the next stage of work, my mission was really to get the record, a stronger record, back from around 1700. We learned a lot about the history of the park in the process, but I could take another 20 minutes to tell you about that, so I won't. So when I started the research project, I created a long list by talking to lots of people, doing a lot of desk-based research. That long list had about 112 sites on it. I looked into the history of these sites in more detail to try and work out which ones would be worth going to visit. And if something said its roof had been replaced in the 19th century, then I didn't go to it or whatever, you know. So I whittled that down to 28 sites, which I visited and assessed. And then I selected a hit list of 8 sites that I thought would roughly could possibly provide us with a continuous record. And I guesstimated where the data from them might fall, as shown in that table. And through the course of the project, another couple of good sites emerged, which got added into the list. So I'm going to start in Edinburgh, especially since our chair is from Edinburgh. So I'm going to start the more recent end of things in Edinburgh with Heriot School, where there was a record. I haven't seen the primary record, but a secondary source said that timber from Dalkeith had been used in Heriot School, which was, of course, built in the 17th century. When I went to look at Heriot's, nearly all of the roofs are pine, actually, but the bell tower had some oak in it. So that's what we sampled, and it turned out to be 17th century oak, so that was good. But it came from southern Norway, and actually that's rather unusual because Norway cut off her exports of oak in 1602 because she was running out. So there must have been some specialist means of finding some of that rare Norwegian oak thereafter. The next site, stepping back a little bit, is Abbey Strand, Holyrood, where Gordon Ewart allowed me to take some samples. This is during a big refurbishment stage of works there, so a lot of alterations going on. The stuff I could date was imported. Some of it was incredibly interesting. You can see that curved timber in that photograph. That is a sled runner, and it wasn't the only one reused in that building. There were a couple of others, and they were Scandinavian timber. Whether they were sleds used in Scandinavia and then imported as recycled material, or were they sleds here built with Scandinavian timber? I can't tell. But I think it's really highlighting how short Edinburgh was of timber at the time when the changes to Abbey Strand were going on, and we are possibly looking at sort of 17th century changes, but using earlier material from that site. There were quite a lot of younger younger oaks that I couldn't date. And I should explain that it's only through dating that you can provenance through the tree ring pattern. So the date and the provenance come together when you can date something. There's quite a lot of younger oak there, and younger material with fewer rings is much harder to date anyway, with or without reference material. So there is some young oak in this building, which may be native Scottish material, but at the moment I can't prove it. One of the absolute highlights of this study was something hiding in plain sight, and that is the timber frame within the bell tower under the Crown Spire at St Giles on the High Street in Edinburgh. I certainly didn't know it was there, and I think a lot of us didn't know it was there. It's an absolute gem, and so that has proved actually to be built with native oak. That is so far the only building in Edinburgh that we have identified as having native oak in it. But lo and behold, it does not come from southeast Scotland. It comes from northeast Scotland, and it very, very probably comes from the Royal Forest of Darnaway, because we have data from Randolph's Hall at Darnaway, which has to be built with local oak, and it matches it incredibly closely. And we know from documentary evidence that the Crown and big prestigious buildings were using timber from Darnaway a lot, including in the Central Belt at this time. So we have felling dates in the 1450s, both before James II died, but the second date at the winter of 1459 to 60 is just before he died. And other evidence, which I can't go into, that's another 20 minutes, but that's other evidence points to the patronage not just of James II, but of his queen, Mary of Gelders, who had other buildings built, including Trinity Kirk in Edinburgh. And I should mention that we have just skimmed the surface of this incredible structure. We've got dates from certain levels of it, but not all of it. There's quite a lot of conifer in here, which I didn't look at, but there are other amazing things. This is beautiful woodwork. This is master craftsman stuff. And we even have protection marks on some of the timbers, or at least that's my interpretation of them, these taper marks on the timbers. And they, seems likely to me that they went in, they happened soon after it was built. And then, last in Edinburgh, but certainly not least, a couple of timbers spotted at Kirkliston Parish Church by Rachel Pickering, who'd done a dissertation on the latest stages of this church. It was much altered in the 17th century and later. But these two timbers have been reused at the top of the stairwell into the bell tower, and it has been possible to date them. They were felled in 1203, which I propose gives us a first scientific date for the Norman church at Kirkliston. And they are native timber. But you'll note they're not especially long, not like those long white bars in that first graph I showed you. That's interesting. The best match I got was with material from Calaverat Castle right down in the southwest. But then there's a huge gap in between, so I cannot say where exactly they came from at the moment. So now moving to East Lothian. I only have one site in East Lothian, but my goodness, what a site. This, again, was hiding in plain sight. This is the nave roof of St Mary's in Haddington, the lamp of the Lothians. well, some of you will know, of course, about a long checkered history of this building, and that it was very badly damaged in the Siege of Haddington in 1548, 1549, thereabouts. Not too much known exactly about its construction dates. Said to have been built after around 1380, rebuilt after the burnt Candlemas, when much of Haddington was destroyed. Said to have taken about a century to build. Record of it being consecrated around about 1410. Well, in amongst a plethora of different sorts of timber in the nave roof are reused medieval oak timbers, and they date to the beginning of the 15th century. That isn't the only incredible thing about them. They actually come from Gdansk, East Pomerania. Now, anyone that's heard me talk before will probably have heard me mention Eastern Baltic timber, but oak from the Eastern Baltic generally arrives here as boards, not as structural timber. So that's pretty unique. And we have also a date for one slightly later oak, which comes from southern Norway, and dates somewhere between 1480 and 1500, didn't have all its sapwood on it. I think what we have here are dates possibly for timber reused from the choir, perhaps, in the nave, when the nave was restored to become the parish church, basically, in the 16th century. And then it's been repaired and changed again and again, but some of this timber has stayed in it over all those changes. There's so many more stories from this roof to be told. There's a lot of conifer in here that we haven't looked at, for example. There are marks on these timbers too. There are, well, possibly some protection marks, but there are certainly assembly marks, and a lot of these timbers have more than one set of carpenter's marks, so they've been used and used again. Maybe that later Norwegian timber is dating the original nave roof. So things to discuss there with my colleagues from East Lothian. I'll quickly go over a couple of sites that I looked at. I looked at some material in the National Museum Scotland from Fast Castle that had been excavated some decades ago. That turned out to be from southern Norway. And a community excavation at Buncle. There was one oak post that proved to be imported from Germany, quite unusually, and to have a sort of early 17th century date, but didn't give me the native timber that I was after. So moving to the Scottish borders, Needpath Castle, what a gem. Wow, this has got a lot of original timber surviving in it. We looked at two phases of the oak timbers in here. The roof of Needpath, remarkably, is built with Norwegian timber, felled in 1551, and then there's some additional joists, so I think they may be reused from somewhere else because they're painted, felled in 1565. We are 100 kilometres up the River Tweed. What did it take to get them there? That is something to be researched. But best of all, one of my favourites, I can't have a favourite child, of course, but one of my favourites is that the basement level, the ceiling above the basement, the floor to the leg hall, is built with native oak. It has to be local oak. And that is a structure, very remarkably, which has not moved, not been recycled. It is intact. And even more funny to me is that I was actually standing on that floor when I got married in 2003. Little did I know it would form part of this research project and become so important. I looked at Traquair House. I cannot say that I've dated the roof of Traquair House. It has some oak in it. It's incredibly young material. So it is not dated, but the best possible match I got is with Danish reference data at 1544. And now when you look at the roof of Needpath Castle, you think, well, maybe that is just possible. I think this is a 16th century roof, lifted off. They've elevated the roof of Traquair House in the 17th century, and they've patched it all back together. It would have all fitted perfectly, and in a country short of timber, you wouldn't waste anything. Maybe I do have a favourite child. this project was absolutely amazing. This is a community project led by Ancrum District Heritage Society. They discovered a medieval bridge in the River Teviot underneath the 18th century toll bridge. Very luckily, I was doing this research project when this happened and got involved, and it's been a great collaboration with them and with Wessex Archaeology and many others. I don't know why it's my favourite child, because I can't flipping date it. But it's got very young oak timber that has to be local. It's got wiggly, branchy stuff that is not like imported timber. It's too young, and with the lack of reference data, too young to get a dendro date, but we got the next best thing, a wiggle match date, that puts it in the middle of the 14th century. The materials felled somewhere between 1340 and 1360, and those of you who know about the medieval history of the borders will know that that's a hugely turbulent time. So we still do not know who built the bridge. Was it the Scots? Was it the English? Was it the bishops? We have a bishop's palace just, a mile away virtually from here. We've got Jedburgh Abbey on one side of the water, we've got Melrose on the other. So there are many candidates, and we are hoping for some help from historians to work out the culprit. But an absolutely remarkable site. Huge credit to Ancrum District Heritage Society, and just want to say, couldn't have been done without Richard Strathy, who sadly passed away in recent years. So a summary of my results. Okay, more bar diagrams for you. Look a bit boring, but they're not really. The top group is now the native oak record for the southeast. It's got rather more sites than it did have when I started out, but it is not a joined up record, and that in itself is interesting. If you look at the other smaller chart, that is looking at the picture from southwest Scotland, where we got lots of long-lived oak in medieval sites, and it took only 6 sites to build a millennium's worth of record. But the story is different in the southeast. We've lots of younger material and a lot of imports dominating, especially that gap in the mid-15th to 16th century. So why? Why have we got a different record? Well, this is a theatre of war. I think this is my interpretation, of course, but I think that the impacts of war on the people, on the landscape, on the built heritage. Forestry needs long-term thinking. It needs stable times. I think that is why we have this very sort of broken record, as it were, from this period. And I rather like Walter Bauer's drawing of Battle of Bannockburn, because in the bottom corner you can see some really scrubby little trees. And I think, in a way, he's showing what it was probably like. So the impacts of wars, but we've got possibly another agent at work. I've got this lovely cuddly sheep up there, but woodland regeneration and grazing pressure do not mix, as we all now know from our reforesting efforts now in Scotland. And I think the Borders Abbeys and the extensive sheep farms and so on, that grazing pressures mixed with a lack of sort of management of the woods meant that the woods never really had much chance to recover. The capon tree near Jedburgh is a rare survivor of the Jed forest, and I think the name implies that it was the hanging tree, and that is why it survived. But most of the Jed forest has gone. So the advances, we've identified several new sites, but we've not found that old growth timber. We've got early supply issues, most evident in Edinburgh and East Lothian from around about 1400. We're relying on long distance transport, imports. Scotland, of course, looked to Europe and Scandinavia for its trade, not to England in medieval times. And so that's why we have so much European material in our buildings. And, well, I've put the Lubeck letter up there because that was William Wallace and Andrew de Murray saying to the merchants across Northern Europe, we are open for business again. And those trading connections continued. There were Scots settlements in many of these places across Northern Europe. Why do this sort of stuff? Well, it gives you precision dating. We've got dates now for several sites that we didn't have before. And we can see that there is some later oak woodland recovery. We've got planting in parks like Dalkeith. We've got post-Reformation woodland creation, possibly. Those timbers in that townhouse in Jedburgh were very young, and I think they just started life just after the Reformation. That could be sort of an industrialist investing in timber production. A learning resource came out of this. I could another 20 minutes on this, but conservation message, we have done very little dendro in Scotland compared to England. Really needs more support, just needs more support. Won't go into that, but you can see the benefits of doing it. And finally, I want to say, don't think that I have done South East Scotland. I haven't. I have just looked at a little sample, really. There is so much more to learn and to find out. We've seen that our native oak record is sparse, but that makes every surviving site with any oak in it really valuable. We can't tell when we first look at it whether it's imported or native. The only way to find out is to analyse it. We have, unusual record here, no long-lived oak timber, but I've explained why, these various impacts. We have this big reliance on imports, but isn't that exciting? That connects us to the whole of the north of Europe and Scandinavia. The potential in pre-Reformation churches is extraordinary, and this will all be in a publication coming to you soon. So thanks very much for listening. You can find me on social media, including Mastodon, where all the cool kids hang out. Thank you.